The family posed photo in 1898. A century later, they discovered who was really in the background. Sarah Martinez stood in her grandmother's attic on a cold November morning in 1998, surrounded by cardboard boxes that smelled of age and memories. As a history professor at Boston University, she had spent years studying late 19th century American life, but nothing prepared her for what she was about to discover in her own family archive. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had passed away 3 months earlier, and Sarah had volunteered to sort through decades of accumulated belongings. Most items were mundane: old clothes, receipts, letters about everyday matters. Then she found a leather portfolio tucked beneath a stack of quilts. Inside, carefully wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a large photograph mounted on thick cardboard. The portrait showed 7 people arranged formally in front of a brick building. The sign above them read, "Harrison Textile Mill, Estuchter, 1887. Sarah recognized some faces from other family photos. Her great-great-grandfather, Thomas. Harrison stood at the center, his wife Catherine beside him, their 4 children arranged around them in their Sunday finest. The 7th person was Thomas's brother Michael, who had died young according to family stories. Sarah carried the photo downstairs to better light. The detail was remarkable for its age. The photographer had captured every thread of lace on Catherine's collar, every wrinkle in Thomas's work-worn hands. But as Sarah examined the image more closely, something caught her eye. Behind the family, partially obscured by the building's corner, stood another figure. A man in a dark coat, his face turned slightly away from the camera, almost hidden in shadow. She had never noticed him before in the smaller copies of this photo she'd seen. Her pulse quickened. Who was this man? Why was he lurking in the background of a formal family portrait? Sarah grabbed a magnifying glass from her grandmother's sewing kit and leaned closer. The man's posture was tense, his hand gripping something at his side. His clothes were disheveled compared to the Harrison family's formal attire. Most strikingly, his eyes, barely visible in the shadow, seemed to be looking directly at the camera with an expression Sarah could only describe as desperate. The photographer's stamp on the back read, Whitmore & Sons Photography, Boston, Massachusetts, September 14th, 1898. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious figure. That evening, she spread the photograph across her dining room table alongside her laptop and research notebook. She had access to extensive historical databases through the university, and she intended to use every resource available. The date, September 14th, 1898, gave her a starting point. She began searching Boston newspaper archives from that period, looking for anything unusual that might explain a man hiding in the background of a family photo. The Boston Globe archives revealed that September 1898 had been a turbulent time. The Spanish-American War had ended just weeks earlier, and the city was filled with returning soldiers. Labor disputes at several factories had turned violent, but nothing immediately connected to the Harrison family or their textile mill. Sarah expanded her search, looking for crime reports, missing persons, anything that might provide a clue. 3 hours into her research, she found it. A small article buried on page 7 of the September 16th, 1898 edition of the Boston Herald, Police Seek Fugitive in Warehouse Fire. The article described a devastating fire at the Riverside warehouse on September 13th, 1898, just 1 day before her family's photograph was taken. 3 workers had died. A man named Daniel Foster was wanted for questioning. The article included a brief physical description. Approximately 30 years of age, dark hair, medium build, last seen wearing a dark overcoat. Sarah's hands trembled as she zoomed in on the background figure in her family photo. Dark hair, dark overcoat, medium build. Could it be the same man? And if so, what was he doing at the Harrison textile mill the day after a deadly fire? More importantly, why had no one in her family ever mentioned this? She needed more information. The next morning, Sarah drove to the Boston Public Library's Special Collections Department, where they maintained extensive city records and newspaper morgue files. The librarian, an elderly man named Robert, who recognized Sarah from previous research visits, helped her locate additional materials about the Riverside warehouse fire. What she found made her stomach turn. The fire hadn't been an accident. Evidence suggested arson. And Daniel Foster, a warehouse supervisor, had disappeared immediately after the blaze, making him the prime suspect. Sarah spent the next week immersed in 1898 Boston. She discovered that Daniel Foster had been a well-respected member of the community before the fire. He had worked at Riverside Warehouse for 8 years, had a wife and young daughter, and by all accounts was honest and hardworking. Then, in a single day, his life had fallen apart. The fire had started in a section of the warehouse where Foster had been working. Witnesses reported seeing him flee the scene. Police found evidence of accelerant in the area where the fire originated. The case seemed straightforward. Foster had set the fire, panicked when workers died, and ran. But something bothered Sarah. If Foster was guilty, why would he risk exposure by standing in the background of a family photograph the very next day? The Harrison textile mill was only 3 blocks from Riverside Warehouse. It made no sense for a fugitive to linger so close to the crime scene, especially in a location where he might be photographed, unless he wasn't running from the law. Unless he was running toward something, or someone. Sarah returned to her family records, this time looking for any connection between the Harrisons and Daniel Foster. She found it in a ledger book that had belonged to her great-great-grandfather Thomas. The entries were mostly routine business transactions, but one caught her attention. September 10th, 1898. Meeting with D. Foster regarding warehouse contract. Terms discussed. Agreement pending inspection. Thomas Harrison had been in business negotiations with Daniel Foster just 3 days before the fire. Sarah's mind raced. What kind of contract? What inspection? She searched for more details but found nothing in Thomas's papers. However, she did discover something else interesting. Several newspaper clippings Thomas had saved from September 1898, all related to the warehouse fire. Why would Thomas carefully preserve articles about a fire unless he had some personal connection to it? Sarah needed to find out more about Daniel Foster's fate. Police records from 1898 were housed at the Massachusetts State Archives. She made an appointment and spent an entire Saturday digging through dusty boxes of case files. Finally, she found it. Boston Police Department case file. Number 1898-847. Investigation into Riverside Warehouse fire in pursuit of suspect Daniel Foster. The file was thin, containing only basic incident reports and witness statements. Foster had never been caught. The investigation had eventually gone cold, but tucked into the back of the file was something unexpected. A handwritten note dated October 1898, 1 month after the fire. The handwritten note was barely legible, written in faded ink on a piece of cheap paper. Sarah carefully transcribed it. Detective Murphy received anonymous tip regarding Foster case. Informant claims Foster innocent. Says to investigate warehouse owner connections to city contracts. Informant refused to identify themselves. Seemed frightened. Patrolman Collins, October 18th, 1898. An anonymous tip claiming Foster's innocence. Someone had tried to help him, but the note appeared to have been ignored. There was no follow-up report, no indication that anyone had investigated the warehouse owner or city contracts. The case had simply been filed away, and Daniel Foster had remained a wanted fugitive. Sarah photographed every page of the police file and returned home to analyze what she'd found. That evening, she searched for information about Riverside Warehouse's ownership. Property records from 1898 showed the warehouse had belonged to a man named Charles Whitmore. The name struck her immediately. Whitmore and Sons Photography, the studio that had taken her family's portrait. Was it coincidence? She dug deeper and discovered that Charles Whitmore had been a prominent Boston businessman who owned multiple properties, including the photography studio and Riverside Warehouse. He had city council connections and had secured several lucrative contracts for warehouse storage of municipal supplies. Sarah's investigation revealed something else troubling. In November 1898, just 2 months after the fire, Charles Whitmore had sold Riverside Warehouse's land to the city for more than twice its assessed value. The city had planned to build a new police station on the site. Whitmore had made an enormous profit from property that had recently burned down under suspicious circumstances. And Daniel Foster, the man accused of setting the fire, had been negotiating a contract with Thomas Harrison, possibly related to warehouse operations. Just days before the blaze, the pieces were starting to fit together, but Sarah needed more evidence. She returned to her grandmother's house and searched more thoroughly through the boxes in the attic. Hidden in the bottom of an old trunk, she found a bundle of letters tied with string. They were addressed to Thomas Harrison, but the return address made Sarah's breath catch. The letters were from Daniel Foster's wife, Elizabeth, written in late 1898 and early 1899. Sarah untied the string with trembling hands and began to read. The first letter, dated October 5th, 1898, began, "Dear Mr. Harrison, I am writing to beg for your help. My husband is innocent of the terrible crimes they accuse him of. I know you were meeting with him about the warehouse inspection. I believe you know the truth about what he discovered." Sarah read through Elizabeth Foster's letters chronologically, each one more desperate than the last. The correspondence painted a heartbreaking picture of a woman trying to save her husband's reputation while protecting their young daughter from the scandal. Elizabeth's first letter to Thomas Harrison had been carefully worded, almost formal, asking for a meeting to discuss what Daniel had discovered during his work at Riverside Warehouse. Thomas had apparently responded, though Sarah hadn't found his replies, because Elizabeth's second letter thanked him for his discretion and willingness to listen. The third letter, dated November 12th, 1898, was more detailed. Elizabeth wrote, "Mr. Harrison, as you now know, my husband discovered discrepancies in the warehouse inventory records. He found evidence that Mr. Whitmore was billing the city for storage space that didn't exist and for supplies that were never actually stored. Daniel planned to report this to authorities after gathering sufficient proof. That is why he was at the warehouse late on September 13th. He was documenting evidence. He is not an arsonist. He is being made to appear guilty to silence him." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. Daniel Foster hadn't been fleeing the scene of a crime he'd committed. He'd been fleeing because someone had deliberately set the fire to destroy evidence of fraud and to frame him for murder. And Thomas Harrison had known about it. The question was, why hadn't Thomas gone to the police with this information? The answer came in Elizabeth's fourth letter, dated December 1898. Her tone had changed from hopeful to frightened. "Mr. Harrison, I understand your position. You have your own family to protect, and Mr. Whitmore's influence reaches far, but I beg you to reconsider. My Daniel cannot hide forever. Our daughter asks for her father every night. The men who came to our home yesterday were not police. They wore no badges and made threats. Someone wants to ensure Daniel never testifies about what he knows. The photograph you mentioned, can it truly help prove he was seeking sanctuary rather than running from justice? The photograph. Sarah looked at the 1898 family portrait lying on her table. Thomas Harrison had mentioned this photograph to Elizabeth Foster. That meant the shadowy figure in the background wasn't accidentally captured. Daniel Foster had been there deliberately, possibly seeking Thomas's help. But why was he standing in the background during a family photograph? Why not speak to Thomas privately? Sarah found her answer in the 5th letter, dated January 10th, 1899. Elizabeth wrote, "Thank you for explaining about the photograph. I understand now that Daniel appeared that day hoping to speak with you, but men were watching your mill. He could not approach directly without endangering you both. He hoped you might notice him in the portrait and understand he remained nearby, waiting for a safe moment to meet." Sarah's research intensified. She now understood that her great-great-grandfather had been caught between his conscience and his fear. Thomas Harrison had known Daniel Foster was innocent, but had been too frightened of Charles Whitmore's power to come forward. The letters from Elizabeth suggested that Whitmore had connections throughout Boston's government and police force. Going public with the truth would have been dangerous, possibly deadly. Sarah searched for more information about Charles Whitmore. What she discovered was disturbing. Whitmore had been investigated twice for financial irregularities before the warehouse fire, but charges had never been filed. He had friends in the mayor's office and had made substantial donations to political campaigns. After the warehouse fire, his businesses had flourished. He'd sold the burned property at enormous profit, expanded his photography studio, and acquired 2 more warehouses with city storage contracts. Meanwhile, Daniel Foster had simply vanished. There were no more police reports about him after October 1898. No arrest, no sighting, nothing. It was as if he'd disappeared from history. Sarah wondered what had happened to Elizabeth and their daughter. She searched birth and death records, census data, city directories. She finally found an entry in the 1900 census. Elizabeth Foster, listed as a widow, living with her daughter Anna in a boarding house in Cambridge. A widow. That meant Daniel Foster had died between 1898 and 1900, though Sarah could find no death certificate or burial record for him in Boston or surrounding areas. Had he died in hiding? Had he been killed to ensure his silence? The lack of official records suggested his death had been covered up or that he died under circumstances the authorities wanted to conceal. Sarah needed to find out what had happened to the Foster family. She traced Anna Foster through subsequent census records. Anna had married in 1920, had 3 children, and lived in Boston until her death in 1975. That meant Anna Foster's descendants might still be alive. Sarah spent 2 days searching genealogy databases and finally found a listing for a James Coleman in Newton, Massachusetts, whose grandmother had been Anna Foster. Sarah called the number listed. An elderly man answered. When Sarah explained who she was and why she was calling, there was a long silence. Then James Coleman said quietly, "My grandmother told me stories about her father, about how he was innocent. Nobody believed us. Do you have proof?" They agreed to meet the following day at a cafe in Newton. Sarah brought copies of Elizabeth's letters and the 1898 photograph. When James saw the shadowy figure in the background, his eyes filled with tears. "That's him," he said. "My grandmother kept a small portrait of him. She never stopped believing in his innocence." James Coleman was 78 years old, a retired schoolteacher with kind eyes and a gentle manner. As they sat in the quiet cafe, he shared stories passed down through his family, stories that matched what Sarah had discovered in her research, but added heartbreaking personal details. Anna Foster had been only 6 years old when her father disappeared. She'd grown up with the stigma of being an arsonist's daughter, had faced discrimination and whispers throughout her childhood. "My grandmother never married until she was 40, James explained. She was afraid to have a family, afraid the shame would follow her children, but she also never stopped investigating what really happened. She spent years trying to clear her father's name, but she had no resources, no evidence, just her mother's stories and her own memories of a gentle man who sang to her before bedtime." James pulled a worn envelope from his jacket pocket. "Grandmother left these for me before she died. She said if anyone ever came looking for the truth, I should share them." Inside were 3 items: a faded photograph of Daniel Foster holding a young Anna, a pressed flower, and a page torn from a notebook covered in columns of numbers. Sarah's hands shook as she examined the notebook page. "These are inventory records," she said. "Look, these numbers don't match. Someone was recording false quantities, inflating the amount of stored goods." This was the evidence Daniel Foster had been gathering when the fire started. This page had somehow survived, hidden by Elizabeth and passed down through the generations. James nodded. Grandmother said her mother kept that page hidden inside a Bible for decades. It was the only evidence that survived the fire. But without context, without supporting documents, it was useless. "My grandmother tried to take it to authorities in the 1920s, but by then Charles Whitmore was dead, and nobody wanted to reopen an old case." Sarah photographed the notebook page carefully. "This proves your great-grandfather was investigating fraud. Combined with my family's letters and the photograph showing him seeking help from Thomas Harrison, we might finally be able to clear his name officially." But even as she said it, Sarah knew the bigger question remained unanswered. What had happened to Daniel Foster after September 14th, 1898? Where had he gone? How had he died? James hesitated, then spoke quietly. There's something else. A story my grandmother told me when I was young. She said her mother, Elizabeth, received one final message from her father in spring of 1899. It wasn't a letter. It was too dangerous. It was a signal, something they'd arranged before he disappeared. James explained that Daniel and Elizabeth Foster had created a simple code before he went into hiding. If he was alive and safe, he would leave a specific mark on the cornerstone of St. Mary's Church in South Boston on the 15th of each month, a small chalk mark in the shape of a cross. Elizabeth would check the cornerstone regularly, hoping to see the signal. The mark appeared consistently from October 1898 through March 1899. Then it stopped. Elizabeth never saw another sign that her husband was alive. Sarah felt a chill. Daniel Foster had survived in hiding for 6 months after the fire, leaving monthly signals to let his wife know he was alive. Then, in April 1899, the signals had stopped. Something had happened to him. Sarah asked, "Did your grandmother know what happened? Did Elizabeth ever find out?" James shook his head. Not for certain. But grandmother said her mother believed Daniel had been planning to leave Boston, to start over somewhere with a new identity. In her last years, grandmother told me she thought her father might have gone west, maybe to California. There was a rumor, never confirmed, that Elizabeth received a package from San Francisco in 1900 containing money and a pressed flower like the one she kept. But no letter, no name, just the flower and the money. The pressed flower in James's envelope suddenly took on new meaning. Sarah looked at it closely. It was a California poppy, dried and preserved for over a century. "Do you think this is from that package?" she asked. Grandmother believed it was. She kept it her entire life. James's voice broke. She wanted to believe her father made it to safety, that he lived a peaceful life somewhere far from Boston's corruption. But she never knew for sure. She died not knowing if he'd found peace or if he'd been killed to keep him silent. Sarah spent the next month searching California records from 1899 and 1900, looking for any trace of Daniel Foster. She found nothing under his real name, but that made sense. He would have used an alias. She tried searching for men of his age and description who'd arrived in San Francisco around that time and established businesses or jobs. The task felt impossible. Thousands of people had moved to California during that era. Then she had an idea. In Elizabeth's letters to Thomas Harrison, she'd mentioned that Daniel had a distinctive skill. He was an expert in textile quality assessment, having worked with fabrics before taking the warehouse supervisor position. Sarah searched San Francisco business directories from 1900 to 1905, looking for textile inspectors or fabric merchants. On her third day of searching, she found an entry that made her heart race. D. Foster and Sons Textile Inspection Services, established 1900 San Francisco. Sarah immediately contacted James with her discovery. Together, they hired a professional genealogist in California to investigate D. Foster and Sons. Within 2 weeks, they had their answer. David Foster, note the different first name, had established a successful textile inspection business in San Francisco in 1900. He'd married a woman named Margaret in 1902 and had 2 sons. Business records showed he'd prospered, eventually owning a small warehouse and employing several inspectors. David Foster had died in 1934, age 66, surrounded by his California family. The genealogist found something else, a photograph from 1910 showing David Foster standing in front of his warehouse. Sarah and James stared at the image with absolute certainty. This was Daniel Foster. The face was older, marked by years and hardship, but the eyes were the same. Most telling was what he held in his hand. A piece of fabric, exactly the way he'd been positioned in the 1898 photograph when he'd been documenting warehouse inventory. But the most remarkable discovery came from David Foster's will, filed in San Francisco in 1934. Among his bequests was a sealed letter to be delivered to any surviving members of the Foster family in Boston, should they ever be found. The letter had never been claimed. After working with California courts and proving their connection to Daniel Foster, Sarah and James finally obtained the sealed letter. They opened it together in James's living room on a spring afternoon in 1999, exactly 100 years after Daniel Foster had stopped leaving chalk marks in Boston. The letter was dated 1933, written when Daniel knew he was dying. It confirmed everything they'd suspected and revealed the full truth. Daniel explained that he had indeed discovered Charles Whitmore's fraud, a scheme involving false inventory records and inflated city storage contracts worth thousands of dollars. When Daniel had threatened to report it, Whitmore had set the warehouse fire to destroy evidence. 3 innocent workers had died. Whitmore's associates had framed Daniel, making it appear he'd set the fire. Daniel had fled to Thomas Harrison seeking help, but men were watching the mill. The photograph had been his desperate attempt to communicate that he was nearby, waiting for a chance to meet safely. Thomas Harrison, according to Daniel's letter, had secretly helped him escape Boston. Thomas had provided money and arranged for Daniel to travel west under a new identity. But Thomas had been too afraid to publicly defend Daniel or expose Whitmore. Daniel understood and held no grudge. He'd built a new life in California, had sent money to Elizabeth when he could safely do so, and had always hoped she and Anna might join him. But Elizabeth had died in 1904 from influenza before they could reunite. The letter concluded with Daniel's deepest regret, that he'd never been able to clear his name or watch his daughter Anna grow up. He'd followed her life from afar through occasional letters from sympathetic friends in Boston. He knew she'd married, had children, had built a good life despite the shadow of his alleged crimes. His final wish was that someday the truth would be known and his descendants would understand he'd been an honest man destroyed by corruption. Armed with the letters, photographs, inventory evidence, and Daniel's own testimony, Sarah and James approached the Massachusetts Historical Society and the Boston Police Department. In November 1999, exactly 101 years after Daniel Foster had disappeared, the city of Boston held a formal hearing to review the case. Sarah presented her research, James testified about his family's century-long burden, and historians verified the document's authenticity. The evidence was overwhelming. Charles Whitmore's fraud was documented in the inventory records. Thomas Harrison's letters from Elizabeth Foster showed Daniel had been investigating the fraud. The photograph proved Daniel had sought help rather than fled justice. And Daniel's own letter from California explained what had really happened that terrible September night in 1898. In March 2000, the Boston Police Department officially cleared Daniel Foster's name. A formal statement acknowledged that he had been innocent, that he'd been framed for crimes committed by others, and that justice had failed him. James Coleman attended the ceremony, holding the 1898 photograph of his great-grandfather standing in the shadows behind the Harrison family, waiting desperately for help that would eventually come, but too late to save his reputation in his lifetime. Sarah arranged for a memorial marker to be placed at St. Mary's Church, near the cornerstone where Daniel had left his monthly signals to Elizabeth. The inscription read, "In memory of Daniel Foster, 1868-1934, and Elizabeth Foster, 1870-1904. Separated by injustice, united in truth." Standing at the memorial's dedication, Sarah thought about the photograph that had started everything, her family's formal portrait from September 14th, 1898. The image had captured more than a moment in time. It had captured a desperate man's plea for justice, preserved for a century until someone finally noticed him standing in the shadows. The photograph had been his witness when no one else would speak for him. James placed flowers at the memorial, tears streaming down his face. "My grandmother would be so happy," he whispered. "She never stopped believing. She never stopped fighting for him." Sarah squeezed his hand. "She kept his story alive long enough for us to find the truth." They both did. Elizabeth and Anna, keeping those letters and documents safe for generations. They knew someday someone would listen. As they walked away from the church, Sarah looked back at the memorial one final time. A century of silence, broken at last. A man's reputation restored, a family's burden lifted, all because a historian had looked closely at an old photograph and wondered about the figure standing in the shadows, hidden in plain sight for 100 years, waiting patiently for someone to see him and ask, who was really there?